1995. He was the author of the volumes dealing with politics, strategy and diplomacy, Crises and Commitments, published in 1992, and A Nation at War, published in 1997, and general editor of the 9-volume Official History. Professor Edwards will consider the Cold War era. Well, thank you very much, Marcus, in his usual persuasive way, conscripted me to this, so I had no option. But thank you all for giving up one of Melbourne's nicer days in this very uncertain spring to sit indoors and listen to the likes of me. I'm going to see if I can manage this. Whoops. Yeah. Quite complex, really. There we go. No, that doesn't come on. See, it's showing there, but not there.
I'll smack it around.
Okay, let me start by making a few general comments about this term interests, which is at the heart of our discussion today. We sometimes talk as if interests, and we all know that security interests and economic interests are coming under tension as never before. But a lot of the discussion talks about values as something separate from interest, and as if it's something new in the current context to have values being considered in our strategic arguments. It's also being stated sometimes that identity is a new phenomenon in politics, and particularly in global politics. I'd like to point out that I don't think these are new at all, that values and identity are very much bound up with who we, how we see ourselves in the world. Our predominant interest has always been, I think, to have a stable region in a stable world. And we want to see not only the power, but the values of like-minded nations dominant, securing a world order that suits us. Australia has very seldom been a revisionist power. It's always been one that's been basically concerned to defend the status quo, to defend the established world order against those who threatened it. At various times, rivals to the British Empire, European rivals, and for a time even the US. Then fascist powers, more recently communist powers, and so forth. And strategy has always been a matter of identity as much as quantifiable security and economic interests. We have we've not looked to Britain or the United States or as just a convenient ally that is somebody with whom we can support ourselves, whose support we can seek in the current situation. We've seen ourselves as British. As Tom mentioned this morning, we saw ourselves as there was this British race patriotism around the time of the Boer War. Or more latterly, we've seen ourselves as Western, or these days supporters of the liberal international order. And to defend it against, to defend our place in the world, Australians have generally sought to seek a balance between an emphasis on our global identification and alliances and a more limited regional and some would say a more independent approach. And usually the powers that be, the government of the day, will try and strike a balance between the global and the regional. I think a convenient way of looking over the whole 20th century is to see 4 phases of this strategic approach. In each case, there's a major conflict and then the settling down as Australia comes to terms with a new world order. And in that, as it identifies what the threats may be to that order, the authorities try to strike a balance between those global and regional approaches, between those people who look first and foremost to an alliance with a great powerful friend or more, and those who look to a more independent and regionally focused policy. The first of those 4 phases was what Tom was talking about this morning. And at that time, the balance that was struck was a fairly clear balance and a tension between nationalism and imperialism. This is the period when Alfred Deakin spoke of himself and his fellow Australians as being independent Australian Britons. A nice balance, having it both ways, which is a characteristic Australian approach. And that led to various compromises in our defence thinking. In the 1903 Defence Act, for example, it was laid down that military service we could have compulsory military service at home, but only volunteers would be sent abroad, because that seemed a more imperial venture. And that is why, of course, the great force that was sent across in the First World War was called the Australian Imperial Force. They were all volunteers. The second phase is essentially what David was talking about this morning. When Australia, quite surprisingly in a way, in reaction to the First World War and from Versailles onwards, didn't try to reinforce the more nationalist wing of that balance, but, as Americans would now say, doubled down on the imperial side. So the 20s and 30s were a period where Australia was more imperially oriented, if you like, than it had been even before the First World War. You see that in trade, imperial preference. You see that in diplomacy, our very hesitant steps towards an independent diplomatic network. You certainly see it in defence. You see it in migration. And as somebody mentioned this morning, Bruce's motto of men, money, markets, meaning British men, British money and British markets. So now we're going forward to the 3rd and 4th phases, which are respectively 45-65, the forward defence era, and then we'll come to the next one in a moment. 45, after 45, there's obviously a period of uncertainty as the world settles down after this, the biggest war the world has ever seen, and trying to work out what is actually happening. And it took a little time for Australians to realise that there were 2 huge new historical processes in play. One was the Cold War between international communism, as it was obviously often defined, and the democratic nations of the world. The other one was the unexpectedly rapid decolonisation of the British empires, which in our part of the world meant the British, French and Dutch empires. Few people had expected the decolonisation process to be quite as rapid as it has actually happened in this part of the world. Now, Australia came to this, as you will know from the end of David's talk this morning, with a number of legacies from the World War II experience. A considerable focus on the region, and a sense that we were very much a potential threat, or open to threats from the north, from militant Asian powers. but also the structures that we had and the military traditions that we had were rather different from what was going to be needed in this new era. We often say that Australia is accustomed to fighting in coalition with allies. We might actually extend that slightly and say we're accustomed to fighting in coalitions, plural, because very much single service coalitions. By and large, there's been a few exceptions, but by and large it's been large army forces fighting with allied armies, our navy fighting with allied navies, Air Force and the Empire Air Training Scheme, of course, very symbolising that. So that was the tradition, and a lot of those structures and the actual forces in play, as David mentioned, remained the case throughout this period, irrespective of whether they were well suited to the challenges ahead. In fact, even the training programs, my great friend and colleague on the official history, Ian McNeill, told me that when you arrived at Duntroon as a cadet in the, I guess, the early 50s, Duntroon cadets spent as much time preparing for Arctic warfare as they did for jungle warfare. But then after a little time, somebody realised that it really was more likely that Australian Army officers would be fighting in the jungles of Southeast Asia rather than northern Norway. And so, that was adjusted, but it took a while for those sorts of adjustments to make. So forward defence was never set out in a white paper or similar document. It evolved over time. And a lot of the ideas behind it can be seen from the decisions that were taken, and indeed some decisions that were not taken about our military commitment during this 20-year period from 45 to 65. And a lot of them derive from our experience in the first conflict, first major conflict of this period, apart from the Malayan emergency, which was seen very significant at the time. But the first major commitment of forces was to Korea. And the Korean War of the early 50s came to be seen as a sort of template for how the Australian government was going to make military commitments, or to decide which military commitments it would or would not undertake, even though it came about very unexpectedly, and the forces we sent were basically the forces that we happened to have in the region, in the British BCOF, British Commonwealth Occupation Force in Japan. But evolving through this period, you can see that forward defence, which was often, has often been, and is to this day often dismissed as a sort of combination of the red peril and the yellow peril and knee-jerk reactions and so on. It was a bit more thought through and a bit more principled than that. Firstly, Australia would only commit forces to Southeast Asia in this period, not to the traditional areas of Europe and the Middle East. This was not as automatic a decision as you might think. Our major ally at that time was Britain, and for a time in the late 40s, early 50s, when there was a real fear of World War III against the Soviet Union, the British were putting quite a lot of pressure on, through both political and military authorities, to say Australia would commit itself once more to the region where, and you can imagine the Churchillian rhetoric, where you chaps did so well, Tobruk, etc. The Menzies government said no, Southeast Asia only. A major exception during this time was, of course, the Suez in 1956, where that was an aberration. It was not coincidental that Menzies was overseas and away from his cabinet as well as other people at the crucial time. But the second bit was we would only commit our forces in Southeast Asia, but not alone. Only with Britain or the United States, or preferably both. Now, I'll come back to that in a moment, because that was a fundamental and it was more complex than it seems. But the third element was we would only enter conflicts by invitation of those people that we regarded as the legitimate authority. We weren't going to be involved in invasions. It makes an interesting contrast, for example, to the 2003 commitment to Iraq. But we were doing this alongside powerful allies, because we had that sense, it has been mentioned, that we couldn't possibly stand up by ourselves to any realistic threat in the region. And at the same time, we wanted to keep our defence budget low. An artificially low ceiling was put on defence expenditure. So basically what we were doing was sending more or less token forces that would allow our allies to say that they were not involved in an imperialist or quasi-imperialist mission. They were fighting as part of an international coalition with respectable allies like Australia. But Australia wouldn't have to do too much, have to spend too much in this context. We were doing enough to keep the British and the Americans committed to the region. But because that might look as if it's a whole bunch of white countries, and throw New Zealand as well, trying to tell Asians how to run their affairs, we were very concerned throughout this period to make commitments in a multinational and particularly multi-ethnic context. Now, the ideal one was the United Nations, which we had in Korea, but the later commitments didn't have that benefit. For most of the late 50s to early 60s period, even though the ANZAC Treaty was signed in 1951, you'll find much less comment in Australian public statements, government statements, much less about ANZAC than about CETO. CETO being the attempt to create a Southeast Asian equivalent of NATO. It looked pretty weak, but despite its obvious weaknesses, and I can go into that if you wish, the Australian government kept pressing that, because it did say that we had some local Asian allies, the Thais and the Philippines in that case, and also Pakistan, because they thought that might help them against India, which was somewhat misleading. In the Malayan region, they were not involved in CETO, but the Commonwealth gave that sort of context of that we are not just white people trying to tell the Asians what to do. Now, come back to that question of the US and Britain. Because we often talk at this time and say, oh yes, this is the period when we transferred our primary strategic alliance from Britain to the United States. As if that was a relatively simple and straightforward process. It was anything but. For a start, there was a sense, many people, from Menzies, Prime Minister Menzies on down, that the United States had the power, the indispensable power. It was roughly as militarily powerful as all the rest of the nations of the world put together. But its judgment was another matter. There was something which I've sometimes referred to as the MacArthur factor, coming partly from Australian experience of working with MacArthur during World War II, but also his role in Korea, in the Korean War, the pressing forward to the Yalu and so on. So people, and especially Menzies, but his whole generation, tended to think that the UK had been much weakened by the war, but it was more experienced. It knew how to handle these things. You could rely on British judgment much more than you could rely on American judgment in matters. Menzies seems not to have learned from Suez that was a questionable attitude. And in fact, you can see that Menzies himself, in effect, was representing both Britain and New Zealand during the offshore islands crisis of the early 50s, basically persuading the Americans to stand firm against China, which we, like the Americans, did not recognize, the Beijing, whereas Britain did. We were urging, and Menzies was urged on behalf of the Commonwealth countries, was urging the United States not to push that crisis into a Third World War. We often talk these days about the Maralinga episode, where we handed over large tracts of Australia, in effect, so that the British could test nuclear weapons in a rather irresponsible way. The basic thought behind that was that this was how Australia, and it was how Canada and others, could reinforce Britain or bring Britain back to a world power status. And the benefit for us would be that we would have two powerful, nuclear-powered, great and powerful friends, rather than having to rely on just one. But it got very tricky trying to keep both Britain and the United States on side, trying to keep in with both of them, especially after, in two respects. One was that from the mid-50s onwards, the UK stopped thinking of Indochina as part of a series of dominoes, actually. The UK, in the crisis of 1954, around the time of Dien Bien Phu and the division of Vietnam and so on, the UK said, we're not going into Indochina. If the French can't win, then it's all over. And they did not back the Americans, who said, we're going to go in and succeed where the French have failed. It also became even more difficult because the British and American attitudes towards Indonesia was a major problem, and that mattered far more to Australia than Indochina or anywhere else in the region. In fact, what you see throughout this period, seldom in public statements, but often behind the scenes, what the Australians are really worried about is any potential threat to Papua New Guinea. Because remember, Indonesia had taken over the western half of the island of New Guinea. We still had responsibility for what is now the independent nation of Papua New Guinea, and were really frightened of conflict on that border. So, by and large, this policy worked quite well through the 1950s. The commitments to the Malayan emergency and the Indonesian confrontation, and various other commitments that were considered and for various reasons not taken or weren't required. It worked well for several reasons. We trusted the Allies' tactics and judgment. We worked well with the British. We were able to exercise independent diplomacy and military assessments. In the early 60s, particularly, there was vigorous and contested policy making involving Prime Minister's Department, Foreign Affairs Department, then known as External Affairs, and Defence, over confrontation. But the outcome was very successful. In Vietnam, the difficulty was much bigger. There were much bigger challenges in implementation. But what worked through most of that period was the policy known as graduated, which the Australians like to call graduated response. So that when a call came from one of our allies to say, look, we want some action here, we want you to commit forces, our response was generally to start with the smallest that we could get away with. What we were essentially, what the politicians in effect said to the departments was, what have we got? And the answer was not very much, and most of it was, left over from World War II. And what can we do that would be seen as useful to our allies, but not expose us too much to political pressure at home or diplomatic pressure abroad? And above all, not to get too many Australians in harm's way. So it started from small things like sending, or relatively small commitments, like sending Air Force transport aircraft. Now they're actually very useful. And in areas like Southeast Asia, where our side had air control, it was not very risky, but it's sort of bread and butter flights. Being able to fly supplies and personnel around the place is a very useful thing. It doesn't win many medals, it's not very glamorous, but it's actually damn useful. Similarly, naval blockade offshore is a useful thing to do to establish control of the local seas. You then escalate under pressure to sending perhaps army engineers, or if maybe you send training units, and you'll remember the first forces, significant forces sent to Vietnam, apart from the airport transport, was the army training team. Finally, the crucial decision is, are you going to send an infantry battalion? And the permanent army that was established, as David mentioned, in 1948, only consisted of 3 battalions of infantry. So, sending one of them was a sign that we were actually getting serious about it. But we didn't have many to send. And that's why things got a bit sticky in the mid-60s, because the first battalion to be sent in 1965 was to confrontation. And then soon after that, we sent the first battalion, 1 RAR, to Vietnam. And with only 3 battalions, you're not going to support a rotation of, you're not going to be able to replace them or rotate them. What in fact happened was the confrontation wound down, so we didn't have to send more there. But as the Vietnam commitment escalated from sending 1 battalion to 2 to then to 3, you had to have 9 battalions to support a 3 battalion commitment. You'll notice that this is all in Army terms. The fact of the matter is, and I acknowledge the Navy League support for this operation, but we are still maintaining the sense that Australia's military contribution is going to be Army, predominantly. At its peak, the Australian commitment to Vietnam was around 8,000 personnel, of whom about 7,000 were Army. About 5,000 were the task force. So the so I'll come back to that in a moment. But during this time also, what is happening is that the policy-making structures of that are shaping Australia's commitments are evolving, but very slowly, from what had been inherited from World War II. In the 1950s, if a situation arose where Menzies felt he had to make a decision, his aim was to get together the Minister himself as Prime Minister, the Minister for Defence, the Minister for External Affairs, and the Secretaries of those three departments. But since the Secretary of Defence was still in Melbourne, the Minister for External Affairs, Dick Casey, was probably overseas on a long mission. The Minister for Defence, Philip McBride, was probably on an outback property in South Australia. So it was a pretty small bunch of people who were deciding what would actually happen. At this time, Defence wasn't a department. It was 6 and then 5 departments, a group of departments, with separate departments for Navy, Army, Air, Defence Central, and Supply, and for a time Defence Production as well. In other words, inter-service rivalry was not just present, it was institutionalised. And a lot of the services and a lot of the chiefs of staff seemed to spend more time trying to do down their rivals in the other services than they did to collaborate. I'm very glad that in Peter Lay's day none of that was tolerated. But there was very slow progress towards jointery, as it's sometimes called, joint activities. And in fact, even as late as 63, 64, when the government said that we're not going to get away with cheap defence policy for much longer, there's got to be, we've got to upgrade our defence. What came out of that was described, they went to the Defence and said, what do we need? And as Sir Arthur Tang, the head of External Affairs at the time, said, it was 3 shopping lists. We'd like more ships, we'd like more tanks, we'd like more aircraft. No sense of a coherent, strategically based defence policy. It was during this time that External Affairs was knocked into shape from a bunch of talented individuals into something like an effective department. And they had, did a lot of defence work at the time. It was during this time that a number of intelligence organisations were founded, but they also operated much more towards their own departments or their own identity. There was no coordination or sense of an intelligence community. The defence, there was some coordination, the Defence Committee at the official level, and it was not until the early 60s that there was a ministerial committee called the Foreign Affairs and Defence Committee. The first sort of embryonic idea of what is now the National Security Committee of Cabinet. But what was prominent all this time was the sense that the Prime Minister could always manipulate the system, could always dominate the system, that major decisions on defence policy came down in the last resort to the Prime Minister. And that was very evident in the process by which Australia became committed to Vietnam. Now, the Vietnam commitment was not an altogether happy one. The command and control arrangements were far more complex than had been the case in Malaya, for example. We had Australians simply knew much less about mainland Southeast Asia than they did about maritime Southeast Asia. We didn't know much about the former French Empire compared to what we knew about what is now Malaysia, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, etc. The Navy and the Air Force had important niche roles in Vietnam, but many of them, their senior people, did not really see Vietnam as their war, and it left a legacy of mistrust in certain areas, especially over the control of helicopters. So the experience of after 1975 was such that, just about politically speaking, practically all the concepts that could be associated with the Vietnam War were brought into question. Forward defence was ridiculed, and people backed away from that idea. The US alliance, well, that clearly hadn't worked. We'd been associated with a great strategic disaster of the Americans. Even sending expeditionary forces, all those sorts of ideas, anything, even uniforms and things that could be associated with Vietnam, were seen as faulty, as ineffective, some would say immoral. It was, and very few people were willing to take what is sometimes identified as the Lee Kuan Yew line, that the commitment had in fact succeeded in a sense, perhaps more for Australia than for the United States, by gaining 10 years for the potential dominoes, so that the strategic situation in the region by 1975, when Vietnam actually fell, was very different from what it had been in 1965, when the first Australian troops were committed. And a lot of people made sort of rather pompous statements. One I like is towards the end of the war, at the end of the war, as it was being seen to fail, the then Prime Minister Gough Whitlam made a statement saying it, it had always been wrong. He said, "Who controls Saigon has never been a factor in Australian strategy." Now, he, as an Air Force officer during the Second World War, ought to have known that the Japanese aircraft, which sank the Prince of Wales and the Repulse and gave air cover to the successful Japanese move on Malaya and Singapore, and the collapse of the Singapore strategy, those Japanese aircraft flew from airfields near Saigon, which was possible because who controlled Saigon was the Vichy French regime, which collaborated with the Japanese. Anyway, so there was a move towards what was called self-reliance, which, and there was much talk of the Defence of Australia principle. Defence people are well-known acronym for maniacs, so DOA became the phrase of the day. What did this actually mean? Well, it certainly meant less reliance on the US and less association with the US. The joint facilities, Pine Gap, etc., were questioned. Was it wise for us to be linked with that? And defence authorities had to recast the value of the US alliance as contributing to peace. For example, Pine Gap monitoring the Soviet missile tests and the like. What I think is also important is that during the decade from the mid-70s to the mid-80s, there were major changes not only in strategic policy and debate about strategic policy thinking, but also changes to policy-making structures which could embed those changes. Defence at this time was reformed, based on the 1974 Tang report, so that instead of 5 departments, there was one defence department. A great emphasis on a joint force structure. The former chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee, who was just a committee chairman, emerged into what became today's CDF, Chief of the Defence Force, with command over the 3 services. So it was not just a change of organisation, very controversial at the time, but also a change intended to develop strategic policy making potential, with significant input both from all 3 services and from the civilian public service. During this decade, intelligence organisations were also reorganised, principally through 2 royal commissions and another inquiry that were commissioned by 3 prime ministers from the same individual. All this leads to the DIB report in 1986 and the Defence White Paper of 1987, where the great, the mantra now is, for defence is out, self-reliance in an alliance context. again, nicely balancing those two. That becomes the mantra. The emphasis is on the continent and its approaches. Even Vietnam is seen as being a rather distant commitment. There's much talk, particularly by Paul Dibb, of the air-sea gap, particularly to the north of Australia. The Middle East is seen as being very far remote from Australia's interests. And the talk of the air-sea gap and the approaches to Australia means that there's rather more expenditure on the Navy and the Air Force and rather less on the Army. Now, for a time, this seems to work, and Foreign Affairs welcomes it under both Bill Hayden and Gareth Evans. They welcome what they saw as a much more autonomy from the American alliance. But all this worked through the 80s and into the early 90s in most people's opinion. But that was to a large measure because it was a very benign environment, both globally and regionally. It wasn't clear what the threat was, and therefore you could have a theory, an approach like this without having to define how you were going to meet a major threat. It reminded me of something that some visiting defence experts said back in, I think, the 1950s, that Australia's defence problem is that it doesn't have a defence problem. Meaning that it didn't have, it wasn't like France in the 1930s or Israel in the 1960s, 70s. It knew exactly where the threat was, and the question was how to deter it. The Cold War was easing. There was a major crisis in 1983, and we now know that the world came closer to a nuclear confrontation between the US and the Soviet Union then than probably ever before or since. But after that, the USSR became weaker until it finally collapsed. China was reforming, but this was the period of Deng Xiaoping's hide and bide, hide the capability and bide your time policy. The Mujahideen in Afghanistan were seen as allies against the Soviet Union, so jihadi Muslims were seen as a thoroughly good thing. So by the end of the Cold War, by the early 1990s, that policy was seen as a very successful one. It was, and it had other dimensions other than just defence. In foreign affairs and foreign policy and so on, talked much more about Asia. It was, people were starting to talk of the Asian century. There was a lot of emphasis in the Keating government years, for example, on engagement with Asia as being seen as different from former years. But it was because the US seemed to be enjoying the unipolar moment, supporting Australia, but allowing considerable autonomy, until a whole new set of challenges began to appear on the horizon. China just beginning to be seen as perhaps a potential challenger. Muslims were seen as having been seen as allies against communism. People were starting to wonder about this chap called Osama bin Laden and this organisation called Al-Qaeda. And there were some around this time who were pointing to the so-called arc of instability in the islands to the north and east. But this was just all very uncertain and nobody knew until they started to explode, and that is fortunately the hospital pass that I'm going to pass to Peter Lay for the next presentation. But before I do that, let me try to draw a few enduring lessons, as I've been asked to do, from this whole period. What are the lessons? Firstly, I think we should recognise for what they are the instinctive reaction at any given time of two groups of people in the Australian community, two psyches really. The alliance globalists, as I call them, and the independence regionalists. In fact, Australia at any given time has always had to navigate around those poles, try to find the right balance between them, try to make sure that they in fact do what governments often say they do. We have a policy which means that our alliances reinforce our regional commitments and our regional commitments reinforce our alliances and so on. Actually achieving that is more difficult than it looks. Secondly, we should recognise that the real threat has perhaps seldom, perhaps never, been of invasion. The real threat to Australia's interests, broadly defined, has been of a radical change, a radical adverse change to either or both of the world order and the regional order. So what we have to do is to identify the real threat and formulate policy accordingly. Now that's a changing phenomenon. We have to do that all the time. And frankly, Australia hasn't had a lot of experience in doing that because we've had almost a set and forget attitude to our strategic policies in general. We say we're aligned with these allies, and we're just going to act accordingly. We haven't had the experience, for example, of a typical European power in the 19th century, where you're constantly saying, well, if they're moving that way, maybe we should move that way, or whatever. We haven't had to develop that sort of strategic capacity. And that leads me to the third point, the importance of policy-making structures, developing, sustaining, maintaining the confidence of policy-making structures to allow the relevant agencies to develop deep and sustained knowledge of the political, military, diplomatic and economic developments that affect our region as well as the world. We need to have vigorous debate based not just on prejudice and assumptions, but on information and accrued wisdom. And this requires good strategic thinking in defence, in foreign affairs, and including, of course, the increasingly powerful Prime Minister's Office and Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. And we need to have good intelligence agencies which serve government as a whole and are not dominated by a very good report recently on the intelligence community described as the preordained policy preferences and priorities of a single department. And I have some reservations about the current Minister for Home Affairs and his department, who seem to have adopted the old SBS slogan, "The world is our home." And we need, out of that, more open discussion. I think perhaps the day of defence white papers may be coming to an end. What we need is more parliamentary debates, constantly updating the situation and showing how governments are reacting to not only to these major new challenges, some of which are very evident, but also to the more subtle changes in those developments. So they might be some of the lessons that we can discuss later. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Professor, thank you very much for your very informative comments. I'd like to go back to 1965 in Indonesia and mention that Sukarno was sympathetic to communism, and the country was in a hell of a mess. Inflation was dreadful. I was there at the time, that's why I'm mentioning this. But my question to you is really, was there any thought in the academic world here in Australia about a possible axis between Jakarta Hanoi, with the Vietnam War, of course, and Peking, or Beijing. Immediately after that period, when we were concerned about this axis as residents of Jakarta, there was an unsuccessful communist coup in September 1965, where 6 generals were murdered just near where I live, and 300,000 people subsequently were murdered. A dreadful effect. Do you have any comments on all of that?
Yes. And if you purchase and sign a copy, I'll sign a copy of my book Australia and the Vietnam War, which goes into all this. The situation in the second half of 64 and the first half of 65 in particular was extremely complex and difficult for the Australian government. It was seen at the time as the most difficult it had seen for years in knowing what to do. Because confrontation was going on, as you say, the Indonesian government was becoming more and more radical. There was much talk of the Jakarta-Peking axis, and at one time Sukarno referred to the Jakarta, Peking, Phnom Penh, Hanoi axis, which was something I think sort of dreamed up. But at that time, the Communist Party Indonesia was the 3rd biggest communist party in the world. Only the Soviet Union and China had bigger communist parties. And Sukarno was, he proclaimed 64, I think it was, as the year of living dangerously. It was looking extremely dicey. Part of the problem for Australia was, as I say, we were trying to keep in with both the Americans and Vietnam. Both the Americans and the British. The British were saying, we're staying out of Vietnam, that's too difficult for us. The one you've got to concentrate on is Indonesia. Sukarno's the real threat. They portrayed Sukarno as being a sort of Southeast Asian Hitler with expansionist ambitions across the region, out through New Guinea and into the South Pacific, etc. And they were saying, you've really got to focus on him. The Americans, meantime, are saying, no, you can handle that. Sukarno's all bluster and bluff. Just play it low key. Just make sure he doesn't succeed in confronting Malaysia, but do it very low key. If you're too hard on him, you'll drive him further into the hands of the Chinese. So play it cool. So Australia are trying to balance these and trying to work out what to do where. When Australian ministers or top diplomats said to the Americans, look, confrontation really is a worry for us. It's very low key now, but it could expand. At what point, when is the tipping point, if you like, the red line, where ANZAC becomes involved? At what point, will you back us against Indonesia? And the Americans, they put down a piece of paper which said basically very limited, we're not going to help very much. But their first reaction was to say, well, that depends on 2 things. One, how restrained you are in dealing with Indonesia. Don't do the minimum necessary just to stop him, getting away with what he's trying to do. And secondly, it depends on where you help us elsewhere. Now, what does elsewhere mean? Well, we've got this problem in South Vietnam. So it was, you can see the complications for the Australian government. Now, in early 65, late 64, early 65, both the Indonesian situation and the Vietnam situation seemed to be escalating more or less out of control, or to a very dangerous level. And it's in that situation, late 64, that Australia introduces conscription, which has been this bitter issue, conscription for overseas service, which has been that bitter issue since 1903. And if you look at the documents, the government documents at the time, why do we need to conscript people for the army? Well, confrontation might expand to get onto the Malayan Peninsula. Number two, confrontation might expand across that border with Papua New Guinea, or that New Guinea border, into the area for which we still have responsibility. And number three, there might be a bit more of a crisis on mainland Southeast Asia, which might be Thailand or it might be South Vietnam. That was the order of priorities seen at the time. January, February 65, we commit a battalion to Indonesia, which had been sought by both London and Kuala Lumpur for about 15 months prior to us saying that. They've been saying you should send troops there to help us. We said, no, we'll send army engineers and we'll send various other people. We're not going to send troops. They finally sent troops in January, February 65.
Right.
And then a few months later, April 65, we sent a battalion to Vietnam. If you look at the Southeast Asian situation in early 65, you can see why people are shaking their heads. At this time, Singapore and Malaysia were also at odds. The separation of Singapore from Malaysia came in August 65. The coup that you mentioned in Indonesia was 30th September 65. So within about, if the timing had been different, who knows what the decisions might have been. Because already by 1967, the situation in Southeast Asia looked quite different. There was the war in Vietnam was getting bigger and bigger, but Malaysia and Singapore were getting on much better, like a happily divorced couple. The Thais had faced down a threat in northeastern Thailand. The Philippines were doing better against their local rebels. 67 was the formation of ASEAN. It looked like these countries were going to collaborate much better than they ever had. And of course Indonesia, after that terrible, those terrible massacres of real and alleged communists, it was under a secure pro-Western government which would stay there for 30 plus years. So it looked totally different. And it all comes down to the timing of those events.
The Domino Theory, many people in this room would remember that we were all told that Australia should be involved in Vietnam because if Vietnam fell, then the whole of Southeast Asia would be overrun by communists. Vietnam did fall, and would there be a school of thought that would say that the fact that the proponents of communism could never agree on what that dogma meant or how they should interpret it, coupled with the fact that, as you already said, that these countries resolved their issues internally, fixed the problem of the spread of communism and not the war that was being fought in Vietnam and subsequently lost.
It's a great debate. You can go for hours on that. The way I would look at it is this. In the early 50s, everybody believed in the Domino Theory. And when I say everybody, I mean the communists and the non-communists around the world. Because if you look at what was happening in Eastern Europe in the late 40s, and there were two reasons for it. International communism was pretty united, and as they succeeded, as communist rebels succeeded in one country, it meant that often gave access to, gave them sanctuaries or supply routes to the next country, and secondly, the psychological impact. the communists said we are the inevitable, we're inevitably going to be successful, and so of course this is just the next victory, and then there'll be a next. And there were good reasons for a lot of people to believe that about the 50s. But gradually, as nations, the longer it was prevented, as it were, nations were able to secure themselves politically, economically, and so on. So by the mid-50s, as I mentioned, the British, who had been strongly urging the French and for a time the Americans to stand firm in Indochina, they said, no, Malaya, we think we can, or Malaya, what became Malaysia, we think that can stay secure despite Vietnam. The Americans didn't. And it was very difficult for people to work out, just what the situation was. If Saigon had fallen in 1965, we'll never know just what the ramifications would have been in the region, but they would have been a lot more and a lot more serious than they were when Saigon fell in 1975. So, and to this day, for example, the Singapore government and Singapore authorities are quite happy to say publicly, you did the right thing. You Australians, Americans and so on, fighting because we, Singapore, would not be where we are today if you hadn't done that. So that argument, there is still that argument in the region as well as in Australia. We can never know the answer, but the regional ramifications would have been much worse in 65 than they were in 75.
Last question.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, certainly the resisting communism in Vietnam, it's definitely a strong argument for it in most respects, but I wonder if do you have an opinion on the level of violence that war achieved? Like if you look at the sort of the way that the anti-communist insurgencies were fought in other parts of Southeast Asia, say the British in Malaya and so forth, that they were able to do that using far less levels of violence, property damage and killing people wholesale, and certainly I think when people think of Vietnam, that was truly horrifying, and if it was the way that the Americans and their allies were fighting the war in South Vietnam, could have been fought in a way that might not have been quite so alienating for the people that lived there.
And there is, certainly has been, I think still is, an ongoing debate within the US military about that, particularly amongst people associated with General David Petraeus, who said that they should have learned much more from the British techniques in Malaya and elsewhere. My own view, for what it's worth, is that if some of those techniques had been successfully applied, and if the Diem regime had been more competent in administering them, in perhaps certainly the late 50s, even into the early 60s, there was a chance that other techniques might have worked. The situation by 1965, when the Americans did commit troops, the situation was probably such that it was beyond anything that those sorts of counterinsurgency pacification techniques could have succeeded. It was already beyond that stage. But that's something that people
more troops
still like.
Even the more powerful the opposition became.
Because that was necessary at that time. I mean, there's sometimes the image that the Viet Cong were just these black pajama people sort of lurking around. And the Battle of Khe Sanh involved divisions, I think. These were, whole regiments were being deployed on the North Vietnamese side as well as the American side. So it was beyond the stage where pacification or counterinsurgency, those sort of low-key counterinsurgency probably could have worked. And so you needed these. A lot of mistakes were made, don't get me wrong. And the forces could have been deployed probably in a much more successful way. But to think that the Malayan style approach could have worked in the late 60s, I think is inaccurate.
I'm not necessarily saying I think that it would have. I guess I was just curious to know what you thought, and also to sort of determine which came first. Did the North Vietnamese start deploying, divisions and tanks and so forth? Would they have done that had the Americans not been, carpet bombing the place or sending in?
They had the capacity to do that. Yeah. They were infiltrating regiments by 64, 65.
Peter, thank you very much. No, we're going to have to hold it.